Om Shri Sai Ram. I offer my humble pranams at the lotus feet of our beloved Bhagavan, Sri Sathya Sai Baba. Our monthly webinar topic tonight is on being happy at the end of your life journey and will be presented by Dr. Meera Gondhia and Dr. Jeyanathan. Dr. Meera Gondhia is a clinical lead GP and educational trainer at an inner city London practice. She has a special interest in tropical and reproductive medicine and undertakes quality improvement projects. Dr. Gondhia is also the clinical lead for palliative medicine at the surgery, looking after patients with long-term conditions and supporting end-of-life care. Dr. Gondhia has been a Sai devotee since childhood and held various roles in the Sai organization. She has also assisted in many Sai medical camps, both here and abroad. Dr. Sharavanan Jeyanathan is a GP partner and GP tutor in South East London. He has a keen interest in medical education at medical school and GP registrar levels. Dr. Jeyanathan was former president of Bromley Sai Centre and is currently Region 1 Healthcare Lead Representative. He has a passion for music, singing, and a variety of musical instruments, and had the golden opportunity to sing and perform in the divine presence of our beloved Bhagwan as part of the Sai Mahima pilgrimages. Jai Sai Ram.
My humble pranams at the lotus feet of our beloved Bhagavan Sri Sathya Sai Baba. Respected Sai elders, brothers and sisters, Jai Sai Ram to you all. As a healthcare professional, it is a pleasure and privilege to be invited into the journey of life that patients travel. Like every journey, there is a beginning, birth, a middle, life and living, and an end, that is death. Very thankfully, the majority of the journey is not the beginning or the end, but the middle, that is life and living. That is why nearly all of the health webinars and talks that you have heard over the last several months have thus far focused on life and living. It is, however, very important that we get every stage correct. There are many fears, uncertainties, and misconceptions surrounding dying and death, and today's talk is very much to empower patients, family, and friends about how we can start what seem like difficult conversations in this area to try and plan for what is an important and inevitable part of life. We hope to cover the following things: talking about the journey of life, a story of death, discussing what control we have over this area, what things we could do differently, and retelling the story to see if it has a different outcome if we try and plan ahead of time. The first thing that I reflect on saying is that death is an inevitable consequence of birth. It is going to happen. As a society, we are not good at talking about it. In fact, we are terrible at talking about it. And it can leave the patient, the family, friends, and the community in a worse place when it finally and invariably arrives. Thinking about the beginning of the journey, my pregnant patients will have extensive discussions with their midwives about birth plans, home births versus hospital births, natural versus water births versus cesarean sections. And it is important to discuss these things because we are only born once, and it is important to get it right. The same is true of death. We only do it once. And though it would seem bizarre to talk about death plans, there are some important things that would be useful to know about a person nearing the end of the journey and their wishes about how they would want to end it. Let's start with a case study. This is made up, but if you see any similarities in family or friends, this is purely coincidental. We have a 75-year-old patient with advanced cancer called Joe. The last scans show that the cancer has spread to various parts of the body, and the patient is becoming weaker every day, needing help with feeding and getting dressed. Consultations with the patient and family have mainly centered around treatments to get rid of the cancer, and further chemotherapy is planned. The patient becomes unwell and gets taken to hospital with infection. The patient gets treated with oxygen therapy, intravenous fluids through a drip, and antibiotics. They respond, and a few days later, they get discharged. They found the admission, very difficult and distressing. Regular blood tests, unable to rest due to a noisy ward, and being disturbed for regular observations and medications to be given. They are quite happy to be home again. But soon they deteriorate again and get admitted again. And again, the treatment is aggressive and hard-going. Unfortunately, they have developed another infection, and this time the patient does not respond to treatment, deteriorates, and in the middle of the night, the heart stops. Resuscitation starts and continues for well over half an hour. And with no response to treatment, the patient dies. When people are alive, they are encouraged to take control of their lives and make decisions to make their wishes come true. Before dying, people are encouraged to have a will. This is to ensure that even in death, their wishes, desires, and instructions are followed through. Advanced directives and advanced care planning are there to help family, friends, and clinical teams be aware of a patient's wishes about their care. If they lose the ability to communicate or make decisions, this makes sure that they are always in control. I will now hand over to Sister Meera, who will talk about what we could do differently to have a better end.
Thank you, Dr. Sharavanan. So, as you've mentioned, the one thing we know for certain in life is that we will die, but so many of us haven't thought about it or planned our end stages. Now, advanced care planning is effectively offers people the opportunity to plan their future care and support, including medical treatment, whilst they have the capacity to do so. So it's important to think about this when somebody is quite well, so they can think about how they would like the rest of their life to pan out, especially the end stages. Now, so many deaths cannot be planned and happen quite suddenly, but many can be planned through situations such as long-term illnesses, cancer, frailty, old age. And actually, there is great value and comfort in mapping this out and ensuring that a patient remains in control of their life in sickness and in death. Certain questions that may be worth thinking about is firstly, where would you want to be? So would that be in the home, a hospital, like Joe went in for the first time, the case study that we referred to beforehand, or somewhere like a hospice, which is a halfway house between kind of home and hospital, but not so intense. The next question might be, who would you want to be around? Would you want your friends, your family, medical staff, or perhaps alone? And thirdly, lots of patients and people that I've met in my care before are very worried about, the symptoms that happen towards the end. So I personally have looked after patients who are suffering with pain, and actually there's lots of medications we can give to dampen that down. Agitation or anxiety, it's often something that you see quite frequently, and it's understandable to be scared of death, and actually there are medications we can give to help dampen the anxiety down. I've had patients who have had quite severe sickness through stomach types of cancers, liver cancer, for example, and actually there are medications we can do to help them feel more comfortable. And in the situation in this case study with Joe, who had kind of widespread metastases or widespread cancer, there's something that you could suffer with, things like breathlessness, and there are medications you can give to try and help with the breathing. Next slide, please, Dr. Sharavanan. you. So in terms of thinking about the next step of treatment, there are lots of different terms that you may hear, and it would be quite helpful, I think, to perhaps just explain each of those in turn. So with regards to treatment, when is it correct to say enough is enough? Joe in the case study, went to hospital, had a lot of interventions, and actually felt this wasn't the place for him or her, and then decided to go home. Now, there are lots of different treatment plans. First one could be something like ITUs, that's the intensive care unit. Now that involves sort of organ support and machines that help put artificial breathing tubes down you. They can filter your lungs, your kidneys out, give you support to help pump the heart. And that isn't for everyone. For somebody that has widespread cancer, sometimes these kind of interventions are not really going to help very much. And again, it's something to think about. How would you like to end your life, and what kind of mindset and physically how you'd like to be? So if you're not for ITU, it wouldn't be appropriate for a patient to go to the intensive care unit. So not for hospital means that actually it's not so suitable to go in for kind of IV, so intravenous drips, so drips through the vein, antibiotics, oxygen. But some of these things can actually be offered at home. So not for active treatment means that actually, yes, we're not going to continuously give you those treatments that you may be offered in a hospital, but actually support at home is very easy to set up. And actually there are palliative care teams. So palliative care is actually a medical specialty, and their goal is to relieve the suffering of patients and their families by assessing and treating the physical symptoms, the psychosocial symptoms, and the spiritual symptoms. Palliative care has been amazing. It's come a long way, and really they're there to make sure that the patient is as comfortable as possible. And there are lots of things that we can offer at home if a patient chooses to choose their last stages at there. For instance, again, pain relief, they can give fluids. They can also help with other things, such as financial affairs, arranging carers, arranging fast-track entry into hospices for sort of relief. They can help with the carer, so the person that's actually looking after the relative that might be dying. They can give them some respite. They can even help with things like day trips, or help fulfilling the wishes of the person that's undergoing, the end stages of their life. Next slide, please. So these questions that we've posed here under treatment are all the questions with regards to advanced care planning. Different patients have different medical stories, different values, different life experiences, and there are a variety of correct answers. But these are the sorts of questions that we should ask. And the best time to have these conversations is when you're well, or at least you're stable with regards to treatment. So the questions may be, when should we say this patient should not go to intensive care? So in the case study, it wouldn't be really appropriate for Joe to go to intensive care because one, wasn't keen to stay in hospital anyway, but also how, you have to think about the end stage and actually what he or she would like. And actually, fundamentally, a lot of these questions are the patient's decision. And it's just worth having that conversation with healthcare professionals, with family, and making the best choice for each individual patient. When should we say this patient should not go to hospital? And when should we say if this patient's heart were to stop, that we should let them die peacefully and with dignity? And this brings us really nicely onto the next slide, which is do not attempt cardiopulmonary resuscitation, DNA CPR, some of you may have heard of before. Next slide, please. So CPR, cardiopulmonary resuscitation, is something that somebody could have if your heart were to stop. Now, if your heart were to stop, that would be the end of your natural life. And sometimes as doctors or healthcare professionals, we try to restart the heart again with electric shocks and chest compressions. And often this does not work. And if it does work, then some patients are unable to return back to their normal life because as you can imagine, your heart stopped beating, the oxygen isn't flowing around as much. It can lead to long-term problems with your heart, not enough oxygen to the brain or to the limbs. And unfortunately, the statistics are pretty poor. So if somebody's heart were to stop outside the hospital, there's only a 10% chance that they would survive. That's because the body's organs and systems have failed because of the injury it's come to. As I mentioned, that would be the end of natural life. We restart with shocks, and it can really not lead to a good quality of life after. Now, when I was preparing this presentation, it took me back to my first couple of weeks as a junior doctor, where I was looking after a 95-year-old man, and at the time I was in surgery and we were helping patients rehabilitate patients after they had had surgery. So I was looking after this man who had had a hip operation, and he had quite severe dementia, no family really. These sorts of questions have never been discussed when he was well, and it was discussed on the ward round actually that this patient would benefit from having a DNA CPR. Now, we needed a couple of doctors to sign this, and unfortunately that patient, before that job was done, did pass away, and because that was not in order, he ended up having resuscitation shocks to try and revive him. And actually, unfortunately, he did pass away. And at that point in time, we thought that's just not a nice way to go for a patient that wouldn't have done very well either way. Unfortunately, his ribs were broken because of the compressions, and it just wasn't a nice death. And actually, that's why I've taken a bit more of an interest in this, because I've seen some really lovely ends to life, actually, and patients have had control and had good symptom control, been able to say goodbye, got their affairs in order. And I think it's just a really useful thing to think about. Thank you, and I'll hand back over to Dr. Sharavanan.
Thank you, Sister Meera. I think knowing all of these things, let us replay the story to see what is possible. Remember our 75-year-old patient, Joe, with advanced cancer. We pick up the story after one hard admission into hospital. Consultations have this time, however, taken a different direction. Between the patient, family, specialists, GP, and palliative care teams, the conversations very much are talking about how treatments are no longer curative. Thus, the goals of treatment change to being palliative. That is, one, to focus on symptom control, keeping the patient as comfortable as possible, because a cure is no longer possible. The conversations are difficult, but there is time for the patient to think about it and ask questions with the support of family and friends. The patient is able to think about their options, and with the support of the medical teams, they make a decision that they do not want resuscitation, that if they were to deteriorate again, that they don't want to be admitted to intensive care or to even go to hospital because it was too exhausting and distressing. They are happy to have full treatment at home, and with any deterioration, they want to be kept comfortable at home. They clearly say that their preferred place of dying is home, surrounded by friends and family. A few weeks pass with the patient in good spirits, happy that they no longer need to attend the hospital for repeated tests and draining, aggressive treatments. However, and inevitably, the patient soon starts to deteriorate again. Antibiotics and other treatments are given at home, but despite this, the patient continues to deteriorate. Medications are started to reduce the labor and stress of breathing and to control pain. The patient is increasingly drowsy, but able to speak with some friends and family who have been told that their health is deteriorating. The patient is not in pain, or breathless, or distressed. Surrounded by their family in their last days and hours, the breathing becomes shallow and slower and stops. Now, both cases could very well be real. And unfortunately, I have experienced the first case in various guises But also encouragingly, I also have helped patients facilitate the second scenario also. Advanced care planning is making decisions ahead of time. Though always filled with uncertainty, there are some important fixed things that can help navigate and plan the road ahead. The clinical situation. How have patients in similar situations fared previously? What options are specifically available to that patient's specific situation? Most importantly, knowing the situation. What does the patient want? Now, I know that when listening to this talk, it sounds like there is a correct and incorrect path. However, real life is not that simple. And what matters, and what really is at the heart of this talk, is that what matters most is patient choice, patient's desires, and that patients are empowered to not only make those decisions, those difficult decisions, but also to make those decisions known to their family and medical team to give it the best chance of coming true. To give an example, I've had patients with early cancer diagnoses who engage with multiple incredible and incredibly aggressive treatments like surgery and chemotherapy and radiotherapy. And I've had other patients who say that they want none of these things and they go and travel the world. Now, neither patient is wrong here. As long as the patient is aware of their options and consequences, what matters is that they are in control of what happens to them, and therefore not necessarily what the medical textbook says should happen. Family, friends, and medical teams alike are there to support patients in difficult situations with their decision-making. For instance, some patients may hold very strong personal beliefs and believe that life should be protected at all costs and will endure every treatment option possible. On the other hand, there are patients who do not believe this, that they do not want these treatments, or are afraid of the intrusive treatments and repel from the medical teams altogether. Now, where a patient is in control, these are both correct pathways. I should also make the observation that though I have spoken about death in the context of cancer in this story with these two endings, these principles are applicable, as we have said, to any range of terminal conditions, including lung disease, heart disease, dementia, old age, and frailty. My own personal beliefs on this have changed throughout the course of my medical training and career, from one of throwing every investigation and treatment available, a mentality of we must win, where winning means life and death means defeat. If this is the case, then we will always lose. And this is not a healthy way to look at the journey. Every journey must end, and if every journey must end, then let it end smoothly and controlled. We should be victorious in birth, life, and in death. I feel that as a doctor-patient team, we should win. And winning is ensuring that the patient is informed and in control about the decisions that are placed in front of them. Patients should decide what happens to them, still understanding that deteriorations and ultimately death cannot be avoided. Patients should be in control. Now, with all of this talk of death, I reflect and say, value life and living. Appreciate the gift of life and live it to its fullest. Good advanced care planning and palliative care is very much the end of this wonderful journey and about ensuring that a patient is alive and living and in control until the day that they die. I will leave our beloved Bhagavan to share a few divine thoughts about the end of this journey. Jai Sai Ram.
పుట్టినప్పుడు ప్రతి ప్రాణి కూడాను కెవ్వుని ఏడుస్తాడు.
At the time of birth, every child cries.
ఎందుకోసం ఏడ్చాడు?
Why?
అయ్యో, తిరిగి ఈ ప్రపంచంలో వచ్చి పుట్టానని నేను.
The child cries at the time of birth,
ఆనందం నుంచి నేను దూరమైపోతున్నానే,
to have come to this world,
ఆత్మ నుండి వేరైపోతున్నానే,
feeling so bad for being separated from the soul. So the child cries.
ఏడుస్తూ పుట్టినటువంటి మనిషి ఏడుస్తూనే చావటం వల్ల మనిషి ప్రయోజనం ఏమిటి?
And been born while crying, if we leave this world crying, what for is this life? What is the aim of life?
కానీ నీవు పర్పస్ ఆఫ్ లైఫ్ దాన్ని గుర్తించాలి.
We have to recognize the purpose of life.
ఏడుస్తూ నేను పుట్టాను,
I am born crying.
ఏడుస్తూ జీవిస్తున్నాను,
I lead while crying.
కట్టకడపడికి పోయేటప్పుడు కూడా ఏడుస్తూ పోతున్నాను.
At the end also I
నేను
cry.
సాధించినది ఏమిటి?
What is it I attain?
కాదు కాదు,
Nothing I attain.
ఏడుస్తూ పుట్టినటువంటి మానవుడు నవ్వుతూ చావాలి.
Having been born while crying, one should leave the world with smiles.
కనుకనే దానిని నీవు సరైన మార్గంలో పెట్టుకోవాలి.
This is the proper path that you have to follow.
ఎప్పుడు నీవు నవ్వుతూ మరణిస్తావు?
When can you die smiling?
ఇంద్రియాలు సరైన మార్గంలో ఉంచుకున్నప్పుడే నీవు నవ్వుతూ జీవితాన్ని వదులుతావు.
When senses are kept in a perfect order and way, you can leave the world smiling.
Sairam, I hope you enjoyed that talk, and now we'll open up the floor to questions and answers. If there are any questions, please do just post on the chat box and we'll aim to get through them today. So we have a few questions. The first one, if I can pose it to you, Dr. Sharavanan, is there a legal way to make my wishes known?
So when thinking about this particular question, I would say that there are practical things that needs to be thought about. So discussions that we might have in a consultation room, whether that's in general practice or with the hospice team or the palliative care team or specialist teams, decisions about where things are going, about ceilings of treatment. There are sort of online portals which have been created that allow us to make these decisions known. So if you imagine, things can happen in the daytime, but they can happen in the evening, they can happen in the early hours of the morning, they can happen on the weekend, for example, when your GP practice may not be open. But those important decisions, there are mechanisms in place, online portals which exist to communicate those decisions with out-of-hours GPs, with hospital teams and with paramedics, so that if they arrive at a situation, they're able to check and see, actually, is there any details, any advanced decisions that have been made, by the patient together with the team, so that they don't end up doing something that actually the patient didn't want, and they're able to have that information to hand. So that's certainly one very important sort of strand. There is another sort of line of thinking in terms of things to do with sort of advanced directives, and formally sort of listing those out and making those wishes known to your nearest and dearest, and your GP can always make sure that those that we give it the best chance of those wishes coming true. I don't know whether there was any other sort of strands to this that you wanted to explore at all, sister.
No, I think that answers it quite nicely. I suppose the lasting power of attorney is quite a complex topic, and actually effectively you're assigning somebody to take responsibility. You can do it for lots of different things, so finance, etc. But if we're talking simply for health, you can appoint somebody, whether that be somebody legal, so a lawyer, or a member of the family. So in the event where you weren't able to make a decision, and we call that capacity, then they would undertake your wishes for you, which is why I think it's so important to have those discussions now and when you're well, so that your family and friends and loved ones know what you'd like.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, one thing, even as I was listening back to to the talk and things, I was sort of thinking, some of the decisions are really quite heavy and weighty, and they do, there seems to be lots of sort of implications about things. I mean, once decisions are made, so if we were to think about things like sort of do not resuscitate orders or ceilings of treatment, I mean, what is there any flexibility, or is there any option to reverse those decisions or change those decisions at all?
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, when that decision is made, it is a medical decision, but obviously we would want the patients to be on board. With regards to changing your mind, I mean, if you had any questions or queries, you could definitely go back to the team that that discuss that with you. So whether you're in hospital and that's done, or in the community with your GP, who's best placed to actually have those discussions with. And your GP every year, if you're under something called a long-term, if you have a long-term condition, so for example, heart problems, kidney problems, lung problems, advanced cancer, anything like that, it's often picked up on the database. And GPs are often proactively calling patients in or having telephone appointments to just review that every year. And at most of those appointments, certainly in our practice, we do try to have these discussions. And again, it's just very healthy to just renew and refresh ourselves with regards to what the patient would like, perhaps where if they were to die, where would they like that to happen? And then again, just talking about DNARs and ensuring they have the correct paperwork as well. So if you do have a do not resuscitation order, often you have a certificate at home as well. So for example, if an ambulance were to be called, there's just a copy that you have and that also the practice has as well. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. I mean, certainly, I mean, I think thinking about it, I do, thinking about this whole area, I think even trying to, when I was more junior, just trying to make myself more comfortable having these conversations. I really have, thought about sort of wills quite extensively, and it's like, well, nobody likes to think about it, but actually we do. It is really important to have it, and it's something that's a little bit more acceptable and a little something that we're more comfortable with in society, that yes, death happens, and we want your wishes to come true, and therefore we should have a will in place. And I think in many ways this is very much the same sort of thing. And I think what I would say is that just as a will is a dynamic thing, that actually your decisions can change depending on what is happening to you in life. I would make the argument that that actually there are some similarities to say that these decisions can also be reviewed and updated, and it's very much a dynamic thing. So I would make that, there are some comparisons there that it's maybe uncomfortable to think about and talk about, but actually it's a very sensible thing to have in place. And actually some things that we put in place, or some wills that we put in, they may not be relevant for, sort of, several years. And I have had the situation where, the medical teams have thought one thing, we've come up with, quite robust sort of advanced care plans, and then we've not really needed to touch them or review them for a few years, and then we make use of them sort of further along the journey. So it is important to know that flexibility is there.
Yeah, which takes us really nicely to our next question actually, which is who can I discuss these wishes with? I know we've covered it a little bit, but perhaps if you could explore that in a bit more detail.
Absolutely. I mean, I think first and foremost, I would probably say before you approach anyone medical at all, I would say that the most important people, is first of all yourself, and then, your nearest and dearest, your closest family, and friends. And I think it's useful in two ways. I mean, I think there's something about making us comfortable to think about it, but actually, as I said, as a society, we're not good at having these conversations. And so actually the more normal we make it to think about these things and talk about these things, the more it will actually not only help us think through what needs to happen, it'll actually help we're doing a service to our own family and friends, to actually say, oh, it's not something that I've ever thought about, maybe this is something that I do need to think about, or I can think about. It's not just a question of saying that it's not relevant to me. As I say, it's something that happens to everyone. So I think it is useful in that sense. And then I guess the next steps beyond that, is that your friendly neighborhood GP, who hopefully, if you're in one place for more than a few years and sometimes for decades, I would like to think that your GP is someone who sort of knows you, and you sort of known them, and you've had the chance to build that relationship, and that continuity of care is really is very valuable when you're having these kind of difficult and complicated discussions. And I think that depending at what, really does depend, what kind of stage of life and, stage of condition that you're in, because, there will be specialist teams involved. There will be, dedicated, there are very good teams, like the Macmillan service and Macmillan, sort of cancer nurses who are extremely knowledgeable and experienced in these areas. And then, of course, as we have mentioned, where it becomes sort of useful, we can get teams like the palliative care team also sort of involved. So there really is, a huge range of people who you can have these kind of discussions with. But first and foremost, I would say, look, I think, it's important that everyone sort of think about this and start a conversation, about these things. I don't know whether there was anyone you would add to that list at all.
No, I think that was perfect. Yeah. I think there was a question that someone's posted here. Can anyone terminally ill request for palliative care at home?
So yeah, so I mean, so terminally ill, I think, is a useful term, because I think, as I say, it refers to anyone who is approaching the end of life, and I think that certainly anyone can request, and anyone who is terminally ill, can request for palliative care at home, and I guess it comes down to, there are lots of, no patient is the same, and every single patient has got their own needs, and the palliative care team are extremely knowledgeable and experienced in identifying the specific needs of patients and their family and their support network. And not all of them are always medical needs, is what I would say, though that would be of course would be a focus, but I would say that they're well versed in looking at the common challenges that happen towards the end of life in general.
Yeah. There was a question actually about it in relation about hospice care. So what is a hospice? And it's sort of to do with palliative care as well. So a hospice is a place that provides quite special care to patients that have quite advanced disease and when there is no cure. It doesn't necessarily mean that you go there to die, but there are some patients that will go there for end of life kind of care and treatment. But also, I mean, I've had patients that have gone there that have quite severe diarrhea because of chemotherapy, and actually they just need a couple of days for some fluids and for some medications to help stop them from suffering so much. And then sometimes they go back home, which is their preferred place to be. Other things are, it's quite a huge carer burden for relatives and loved ones to look after patients. And actually, sometimes the carer just needs a bit of a break, and sometimes hospices can provide a bit of respite for the carer and just help the patient, really, just for a little bit of space, time. They organise food, there's often nice gardens, just a different change of scenery, really, and then they can again go back home or to hospital, wherever they choose to be discharged to, and they can also give medications as well. So there are sort of end of life medications. So there are medications being given for pain, breathlessness, anxiety, ones I've mentioned before, and the nurses can set that up in the hospice, but also it's very easy to set up at home as well. So it just, again, depends on patient preference. Is there anything you wanted to add there, Dr. Sharavanan?
No, I mean, I was going to say that the palliative care team and the hospice team are invaluable, and they're made up of more than sort of nurses importantly putting up sort of end of life medications. And you may have heard of things like syringe drivers, which is an important sort of piece of equipment that allows for medication to be slowly given, so that there is continuous relief from symptoms which slowly build and intrude. But it's not just that side of things. It's not only doctors and nurses, but I heard of that that they've got sort of physios, and I think in our local hospice they have a gym for building up strength, for building flexibility, and they've got sort of counselling, and that's counselling support, not only sort of after death but before death. So at every single stage they have those sort of support services sort of available. So really it's I think that my understanding, and certainly the role of the palliative care team, has grown far bigger than just an end of life end of life service. And as you say, I have referred to the palliative care team, and they have discharged patients not only at the end of life. They've discharged patients because they've helped us have those difficult sort of conversations, come up with a plan and say, yeah, things are stable, and when it becomes relevant you can refer back to us if it's needed. So really I really will sing their praises quite highly.
Yeah.
There's a question here just discussing about sort of treatments at home, or if somebody's being managed at home, does that mean that that we're not able to give any sort of medical treatments or medications at all? Like what does that mean?
Yeah, sure. So I echo your sentiment. I think palliative care are amazing, actually, a really lovely specialty, and they also work very closely with us in the community. So our practice will have meetings with them at least once a month and go through all the patients under their care, and our care, joint care. And we often do joint visits together, just to support them at home as well. So yeah, amazing resource, and definitely worth reaching out to the GP if you know somebody that you feel would benefit from them. And often there's almost like a direct kind of helpline. So you'll have a dedicated palliative care nurse, and there'll be somebody on call. So 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, even Christmas Day, there will be somebody there that will be able to help in any circumstance. And in response to your question, I hope we've covered this, but of course, if you're at home and you need symptom control, there is so much that we can do, that the palliative care team can do. So it's not just that we've signed this DNAR, you've been told you're not allowed to go to hospital, that's it, you just have to suffer in silence. That's not the case at all. The whole point of this really is to make sure that patients are most comfortable, that all their symptoms are well controlled, that they have enough care around the block. So even palliative care for patients that have quite quick diagnoses, they can actually fast track, they can get extra funding, and they can put in carers depending on how much the patient needs, and they can help with all sorts of different things, financial affairs. They really manage you very holistically. So of course you're able to have all the treatment, and then those discussions about whether to go to hospital, ITU, etc. are done quite early on as well, just so you know what to expect. And if things do change, you can change your mind. Of course, it's very much about your choice and patient's choice and how you all feel together. And I suppose the last question we've got, and please do, if there's any more questions, please put them into the chat. But there's a question which I think is always quite tricky to manage, actually, but with regards to kind of nutrition and hydration. So how do we kind of feed a dying person at home? Do we need to feed them? Do they need fluids? And how do we manage that whole sort of complication?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that it is, in some ways, it's a very, very tricky area. And actually, in other ways, it's extremely simple. What makes it tricky is very much our own sort of understanding and our own culture, I would say, in many ways, when it comes to fluid and nutrition and sustenance. And these are all things which are involved with taking care of someone, and in terms of those values. I would actually, in this regard, I would say for the vast majority of patients, what is relevant is that the body will tell us. The body will tell us what it's able to do, what it's not able to do. And it's just for us to be really in tune with that and making sure that we're following it. So if somebody is losing their strength, to actually sit up properly, if they're losing their strength to even swallow properly, then the body is telling us, that it's at that stage. And I think that we shouldn't be sort of worried or concerned as long as they are comfortable, not in pain, not distressed. Then we are doing the things that the body is asking us to do. I think that it's more complicated where patients may have been on long treatment journeys where they have things like sort of artificial feeding tubes and things of this description. And I think, the specialist teams would be really sort of heavily involved to guide and calibrate as to when would be the correct time to actually say, actually this is doing, more harm than good. And I would always say that, first principle for us is that we should never do harm with any of the things that we are doing. And many patients, even when it comes to things like drips and fluids, many patients will tell me what a relief it is that they know that they're not going to have to go back to hospital, to be jabbed at again, even if it was, these treatments were given in the best interest. So in some ways tricky, but in other ways very, very simple, that we've got to sort of challenge our own ideas and make sure that we're in sync with what, the body is telling us, and that we are mirroring and following the body's needs at that particular stage of life. I don't know whether you would say anything, sort of add anything to that at all.
Yeah, I suppose my experience is that often when I'm looking after patients in their last stages, they often don't feel hungry and they don't want any fluid. And actually that can be a sign that things are kind of heading towards the end of their life. And actually pushing fluids in. I've seen it in hospital actually where, I think families are quite keen to artificially kind of hydrate, and actually because their protein levels are going down, you push fluids in through drips, they become incredibly kind of fluid overloaded. And that can actually be quite uncomfortable as well. So it's a very careful balance. But I agree, I think don't push unless the patient wants it. Things like often the mouth becomes quite dry. So there are certain things that we can give. They almost look like little marshmallows that just soak up water, and you can put them around the mouth to help just take away the edge off feeling like a dry mouth. But yeah, I totally agree with you actually. And I suppose that takes us to the end of questions. I don't think there are any more. So thank you so much, Dr. Sharavanan, as well for your time, and I hope everyone's found that useful. Did you have any closing statements?
No, I really wanted to thank the Sai organization and our beloved Bhagavan for giving us this opportunity to talk about this. I think that when the webinars were first being proposed and planned, I really sort of had a strong feeling in my heart that actually this is something that we don't talk about and we should talk about, as we are a compassionate and loving community. I think that this is probably one of the most difficult conversations, and yet some of the most compassionate things that we can do to give ourselves the breathing space to think about it, to talk about it. And sometimes life is not in our control, but if it is in our control, then we should try and make sure that we that we have a smooth landing with these things. So really to give my heartfelt thanks for this opportunity.
And also I like to add and thank the Sathya organization to give us this wonderful platform every month to bring these wonderful webinars, and our media team who works very hard behind the scene, and Sister Gayatri to arrange this wonderful speaker. I am sure you will all agree with me that both Dr. Meera Gondhia and Dr. Sharavanan Jeyanathan has done a wonderful job to talk about this very sensitive subject. We all know this is a must event in our life, but we try to avoid it. I think both these young doctors has brought this to our notice that we should be aware and we should be ready and we should be planning to meet our end with happiness, as they explained. Bobby's talk beautifully summarized the whole thing. So again, heartfelt thanks to both of you for such a wonderful presentation. May God bless you all. And our next webinar will be on 4th of October. And I hope you'll all join with another 2 wonderful speakers. Jai Sai Ram.
So